It is 5:30 on December 16, 1944, and the Schnee Eifel is silent except for the drip of thawing frost from the pine branches. Along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes, thousands of German soldiers crouch in the tree line, watching their breath cloud in the darkness. Somewhere behind them, engines cough to life in the fog, one after another, a low mechanical growl spreading through the forest like something waking up. At 5:30 precisely, more than 2,000 German guns open fire along the line, and the sky above the Losheim Gap turns orange. For the American units dug in along this quiet sector, the shock is total. Nobody expected an attack here, in this tangle of hills and forest that everyone on the Allied side had quietly agreed was unsuitable for large-scale mechanized warfare. That, in fact, was rather the point. Adolf Hitler had chosen the Ardennes precisely because it was the last place the Allies expected a major offensive, and because German commanders had done this before. In May 1940, panzer divisions had come through this same forest along these same narrow roads and shattered the French army in a matter of days. The generals planning this new offensive knew the ground. Many of them had driven it themselves. What they did not fully reckon with was that the terrain which had made them legends 4 years earlier was about to become their undoing, not because it had changed, but because everything around it had. This is the story of how the Ardennes, the very ground the Wehrmacht trusted to deliver one last, war-altering victory, instead strangled the offensive from within, mile by mile, hour by hour, until the roads themselves became the enemy. By the fourth winter of the war, Germany's situation was dire in ways that went beyond the battlefield. Since the Normandy landings in June, Allied forces had pushed German armies out of France in a rout that saw entire divisions destroyed at Falaise. By September 1944, the Western Front had effectively collapsed back to Germany's own border. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could barely contest the skies. Allied fighter bombers now ranged freely over German territory, hunting anything that moved by daylight. Fuel reserves, always Germany's Achilles heel, had fallen to catastrophic levels after the loss of the Romanian oil fields and the systematic bombing of synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pulitz. Germany's war economy was producing perhaps a third of the fuel its forces required, and what little existed was rationed with desperate care. Manpower was thinning, too. Divisions that had once numbered 15,000 men now fielded barely half that, padded out with teenagers and men pulled from desk jobs. And yet Hitler, isolated at his headquarters and increasingly detached from the military realities his generals reported, became convinced that one bold stroke could still change everything. His plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein as a deception and later Herbstnebel, called for 3 armies to smash through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive all the way to Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies in 2 and forcing a negotiated peace in the West. His generals, men like Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model, considered the objective wildly unrealistic given the resources available, and said so. Hitler overruled them. The plan would proceed, and it would rely on a factor no fuel gauge could measure, the terrain itself, and the element of surprise it was expected to provide. The Ardennes is not, on the face of it, a landscape built for tanks. It is a plateau of dense forest, steep-sided valleys, and a road network that even by 1944 standards was thin and winding, much of it unsuited to two-way heavy traffic. German planners at the Wehrmacht's operations staff identified just 5 usable routes for the offensive's main armored thrust, designated Rollbahnen A through E, snaking through towns like Losheim, St. Vith, and Houffalize, before opening onto better ground near the Meuse. These were not motorways. Many stretches were barely wide enough for a single Tiger tank, a vehicle that weighed close to 57 tons and measured over 3.5 meters across, meaning that where 2 such machines needed to pass, one frequently could not. The planners understood the risk and built the offensive around achieving surprise and speed before the Allies could react, betting that armored spearheads could punch through the thin American screen and reach open country before congestion became a problem. Fuel was the offensive's other great gamble. 6th Panzer Army and 5th Panzer Army together needed roughly 19 million liters of fuel to reach the Meuse, and Germany did not have that much to give them. The plan, remarkably, assumed that advancing units would capture American fuel dumps along the way and use them to keep moving, a strategy that depended entirely on speed and on roads that did not clog. Reconnaissance and planning fell largely to officers of Army Group B under Model, working from maps and memories of the 1940 campaign, when far fewer vehicles, less artillery, and a much smaller logistics tail had made the same roads manageable. 14 years is a long time in military technology. The tanks of 1944 were roughly triple the weight of those that had crossed this ground in 1940, and 6th Panzer Army alone included several heavy Tiger and King Tiger battalions whose sheer bulk the narrow lanes had never been designed to bear, villages with medieval street plans, bridges rated for horse carts and light trucks, hairpin turns cut for foot traffic and farm wagons. All of it now had to absorb a mechanized army several times heavier than the one that had passed through before. Engineers were tasked with reinforcing bridges and clearing obstacles as the advance progressed, working through the night in freezing conditions. But there were never enough of them, and the further the offensive pushed, the longer and more fragile its single-lane lifelines became. What followed in the first 72 hours was not the clean armored breakthrough the plan demanded, but a slow-motion traffic catastrophe unfolding behind the front line, even as German infantry made real gains against stunned American defenders. In the northern sector, the spearhead of the offensive, Kampfgruppe Piper, a battle group of roughly 100 tanks and several thousand men under the young and ruthless SS Colonel Joachim Piper, was meant to race for the Meuse within a day. Instead, it found itself funneled onto a single road behind 6th Panzer Army's infantry divisions, queued for hours behind horse-drawn artillery and marching troops on roads never meant to carry armor at all. Piper's own after-action comments recorded by his captors after the war describe the fury of watching irreplaceable hours bleed away in stationary columns while American resistance, however scattered, stiffened by the mile. Further south, around St. Vith, the town became a choke point that German commanders had assumed would fall within hours. Instead, a mixed force of American engineers, armor, and the battered remnants of the 106th Infantry Division held the road junction for nearly a week, and every day it held was a day the surrounding forest roads remained jammed with German vehicles waiting their turn to move. Weather, initially Germany's ally, kept Allied aircraft grounded through the offensive's first days, granting the columns a brief window of safety from the air. But when the skies cleared on December 23rd, that same road congestion that terrain had created became a gift to Allied fighter bombers, which found stationary convoys backed up for kilometers and simply worked down the line. Fuel shortages, meanwhile, arrived exactly as feared. Piper's battle group finally reached a large American fuel depot at Büllingen, only to find it had been evacuated or destroyed. Near Stavelot, his tanks came agonizingly close to a much larger dump before it too was put to the torch by retreating American troops. By December 24th, with his fuel effectively exhausted and his column strung out and immobile in the valley near La Glaise, Piper gave the order to abandon his vehicles and walk his surviving men back to German lines on foot, leaving behind the very tanks that were supposed to be racing for Antwerp. The forest had not merely slowed the offensive, it had, quite literally, stopped it in its tracks. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. The bitter irony, of course, is that German commanders had every reason to believe this terrain would serve them, because it had done exactly that in May 1940. Erich von Manstein's plan for the invasion of France sent 7 panzer divisions through this same Ardennes forest, and it worked brilliantly, catching French and British planners who had, like their American successors 4 years later, judged the ground too difficult for a major armored thrust. but the comparison flatters 1944's planners rather less than they might have hoped. In 1940, German forces enjoyed complete air superiority, meaning traffic jams on forest roads were an inconvenience rather than an invitation to slaughter from above. In 1940, the panzer divisions were lighter, more numerous relative to the infantry they supported, and moving against an opponent still mobilizing and reacting far too slowly. By 1944, the roles had almost reversed. American forces in the Ardennes, while initially surprised, possessed far greater firepower, better communications, and, crucially, the ability to rush reinforcements by road and rail from elsewhere in the theater, something France's fractured command structure in 1940 had never managed. The comparison with Allied planning is equally telling. American commanders had judged the Ardennes a low-risk sector precisely because of the terrain that Germany was banking on to hide its buildup. General Omar Bradley later acknowledged that the sector had been thinned deliberately to concentrate strength elsewhere, a calculated gamble on the same ground that Germany was gambling on too, only Bradley's gamble assumed the enemy could not overcome logistics that his own planners understood intimately from years of fighting in similar country. Even the Luftwaffe's own contribution, a supporting airborne drop and a fighter sweep known as Operation Bodenplatte, suffered from comparable terrain and weather problems, with paratroopers scattered across the Ardennes, far from their intended drop zones, and aircraft losses in the January air operation, crippling what remained of Germany's fighter force for the rest of the war. Where the French High Command in 1940 had simply failed to imagine what was possible, the American command in 1944 had correctly identified the danger and accepted the risk, understanding something German planners seem to have forgotten, that ground favorable to a lightning strike is not the same as ground favorable to a sustained, fuel-starved, increasingly desperate offensive fighting for every hour against a defender who now knew exactly how to exploit a single-lane road against an army that could not afford to lose a single tank to a blown bridge. By the time the offensive was finally halted, well short of the Meuse and nowhere near Antwerp, the cost to Germany was catastrophic in terms it could least afford. Roughly 600 tanks and assault guns, along with over 1,000 aircraft, had been lost, alongside casualties estimated at somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men. Figures that remain debated because German record-keeping in the offensive's chaotic final weeks grew increasingly incomplete. These were not losses Germany could replace. Every panzer abandoned for lack of fuel along the forest roads around L'Église and Stoumont was a tank that would not be available to defend the Rhine 3 months later, when Allied armies crossed it with comparatively little resistance. Historians continue to debate how much the Ardennes offensive actually delayed the war's end, with some arguing it merely accelerated a German collapse that was already inevitable, while others contend it briefly and genuinely unsettled Allied confidence before rapidly running itself into the ground. What is not disputed is the psychological weight the battle carries in American military memory, commemorated as the largest single battle fought by United States forces in the entire war, and in German memory as the last real gamble of a regime that had run out of better options. The wrecked hulks of Kampfgruppe Peiper's column remained scattered around L'Église for years after the war, and a King Tiger from that very battle group can still be seen on display in the village today, a monument not to German engineering triumph, but to the moment fuel, terrain, and time ran out simultaneously. Military academies still study the offensive as a case study in the limits of operational planning, a reminder that ground which enables one kind of war can just as easily strangle another, depending entirely on what is asked of it and what is left to move across it. Return, for a moment, to that dark morning in the Schnee Eifel, to the engines coughing awake in the fog and the guns opening fire along an 80-mile front. The men crouched in that tree line believed, not unreasonably, that this forest had already proven itself a friend to German arms, a corridor through which history had once delivered them an impossible victory. They could not have known that the same narrow roads and steep valleys that carried Manstein's panzers to glory in 1940 would, 4 years later, carry Peiper's tanks only as far as their fuel gauges allowed, before abandoning them cold and empty in a Belgian valley. The forest had not changed. Its roads were the same width, its bridges the same age, its hills just as steep as they had always been. What had changed was everything Germany asked the ground to carry: heavier tanks, thirstier engines, a smaller and more desperate army, an enemy in the sky it could no longer keep at bay, and a timetable with no room for a single traffic jam, let alone hundreds of them stacked mile after freezing mile through the darkness. Terrain does not choose sides. It simply exists, indifferent to the plans drawn across it in colored pencil at a headquarters far from the mud and the ice. In May 1940, the Ardennes rewarded audacity with the nation's fastest victory of the century. In December 1944, the same ground punished the very same audacity with immobilized columns, burned-out tanks, and an offensive that expired not in some decisive, climactic battle, but in a slow, grinding failure to keep moving. Germany's generals had studied this terrain for years, walked it, driven it, built their reputations on understanding it better than anyone. And still it betrayed them, not through any secret it had kept hidden, but through the plainest fact of all, that the map is never the ground, and the ground, in the end, always gets the final word.